My name is Ian Stewart. I am the Associate Director of the International Studies Institute, and I want to thank you all for foregoing the trick-or-treating tonight and coming out. We did have a last-minute change in our program. Dr. Lansana Gabere from Sierra Leone was unable to make it here, so in his place I will let our introducer introduce our speaker in a moment. First, let me do some thank yous. These things are not inexpensive, so we do have a lot of help to put on these lecture series. We get help from the New Mexico Humanities Council. It's a locally based Albuquerque organization that put on a lot of different events, and they help support us, which is very important. So I want to thank the New Mexico Humanities Council. They're worth visiting. They're over on Silver Street, and they're worth visiting because they do put on a lot of really interesting programs through the year. I want to thank Loyola Chastain, who works with the International Studies Institute and is behind so much of the legwork in putting this together. She's not here tonight, but I think it's important that we recognize her part of this. We get financial support and help from foreign languages and literatures here, from the English department, from anthropology, from the history department, from the Honors College, from Africana Studies, and I don't want to leave out our important local student group that's helping us out, is the World Affairs Delegation. And I'm going to use that as a way of jumping off to introduce the introducer, who is Jack Mbarian from the World Affairs Delegation. Thanks, Jack.
Thank you, Ian. So it is my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for today. Dr. Stephen Bishop has a PhD in French and Francophone literature and a JD from the University of Michigan. He is the director of the International Studies Institute and an associate professor of French and Africana Studies at the University of New Mexico. Professor Bishop's interests encompass literature and culture of sub-Saharan Africa, law and literature, shame and guilt, feminism, and child soldier narratives. Professor Bishop has published a number of articles on African literature and law, as well as his book, Legal Oppositional Narrative, A Case Study in Cameroon, and his forthcoming book, Scripting Humiliation, Shame in African Literature. He teaches courses on African literature and culture and European and African legal and moral traditions in literature and film. So please help me welcome Dr. Stephen Bishop.
Okay, so I'm gonna start off with the same joke I started off with in the class previous to this talk, so don't answer if you're in the class. Does anyone know what I'm disguised as for Halloween tonight? No? No, I'm disguised as the Sierra Leonean ambassador to the UN. And I say that, as Ian indicated, this is a little bit of a last-minute production here on my part. That's why I have this amazing PowerPoint, which is basically just a piece of paper I'm going to scroll down from time to time. But I do think, the sort of silver lining is that we did not have anyone to talk about Truth and Reconciliation commissions during this lecture series, and that is an important topic. So I am glad to be speaking about that nonetheless. Okay, so I'm going to jump right in. The first thing I just want to point out is, as I wrote up here, I'm going to talk mostly about Truth and Reconciliation commissions, but I put "and reconciliation" in parentheses. And the reason is that there's a lot of other types of commissions. There are just simply truth commissions. And truth commissions are mostly looking at trying to get the truth out there, get people to talk about what happened. They're not necessarily focused on bringing the community together afterwards. They're not focused on that reconciliation aspect, although that is what I will be talking about primarily, the TRCs. Now, there's a lot of definitions out there on TRCs. There's no sort of one perfect definition. This is just one I picked. It says bodies, they are bodies set up to investigate a past history of violations of human rights in a particular country, which can include violations by the military or other government forces or by armed opposition groups. And I just want to point out that there's a couple words in here that are important to pay attention to. So one is past history, okay, past history of violations, meaning it's only looking at things that have already happened. Okay, TRCs are not set up to look at what's ongoing. They're not set up to look at what's going to happen. They're only looking at what has already transpired. The other thing is they're looking at violations of human rights. So, big events, big criminal acts that violate the individual rights of humans in whatever location we're speaking of. So this is not things like corruption or petty theft or things like that. We're talking about big issues like rape, murder, torture, and so forth. The other thing it says, in a particular country, TRCs are not like the International Criminal Court. These are not international organizations that have a global focus that can bring people in to testify or be accused of anything on a global scale. They usually, almost always, are done in one specific country, dealing with acts committed in that one country by people who were from that one country. And then the last thing I just wanted to point out is it says, military or other government forces, so the state, but also armed opposition forces. It does not have to be only state actors, it can be other actors as well. Okay, so since 1974, there have been a little bit over 25 Truth and Reconciliation Committees. So that's a decent number, but you'll notice that most of them have occurred in Latin America or in Africa. There are a couple of places, Nepal's in Asia, Yugoslavia's in Europe, Haiti's in the Caribbean, and so forth. But these have been most popular in Latin America and in Africa. The thing I want to talk about next fairly quickly is what these TRCs tend to be about, how they're run, what characterizes them. So the one thing I already mentioned is that they focus on the past. But more specifically, they tend to have very specific dates, set dates in the past, and set subject matters. Okay? So just as an example, 1960 to 1994, that represents the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So those dates indicate that what they want to talk about is apartheid. Okay? They're not going back to 1767. They're not going back to 1905. I mean, there's some bad things that happened then too. But the TRC for South Africa had this limited window of time they wanted to look at. And in part because they wanted to concentrate on apartheid. The other thing to notice is this says up until 1994, which in part is because apartheid ended. But it's also because the Truth and Reconciliation Committee in South Africa started in 1996. Okay? So you might think, why not also deal with problems from 1995 or the beginning of 1996? But the problem is the TRC was declared that it was going to take place in 1995. So they wanted to put a cap on it because, as we're going to see, for a lot of people, for a lot of perpetrators of bad acts, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission is an opportunity to get amnesty. So if you tell people, we're going to have this TRC in about 18 months, and it covers everything up until then, you're inviting people for the next 18 months to do all sorts of bad things. So you also need a cap for that reason. The other thing, though, is the subject matter is sometimes strictly enforced. So just one example is there was a TRC that declared that acts of torture, which are clearly violations of human rights, of course, but that simple acts of torture were not going to be involved in that TRC. Only acts of torture that led to death. Okay? So, and there were plenty of people who had suffered from acts of torture who said, this is completely unfair. I want to tell my story. But they made that decision because they felt there were enough cases that that involved torture that had led to death, that is what they wanted to focus on. I mean, you have to draw a line at some point. I personally would tend to, include torture, but in various specific situations, they might need to restrict the subject matter that's considered. Okay, a second characteristic of almost all TRCs is that they are temporary. They do not go on for 10 years. They do not go on forever. Oftentimes they only last 3 months, 6 months, 2 years. Okay? They have this set time period when they're going to be doing the testimony, when they're going to be questioning people, and then it's over. Okay? And there's a couple reasons for that. One is that they only have so much time. If you keep a TRC open for 10 years, you have to pay people to run that for 10 years. These can be quite expensive, and money can run out. Another thing is you want to encourage people to come forward, although that can be, I mean, we're going to talk about this in a little while, that can be somewhat pressuring on victims, but nonetheless, you want people to feel like they need to come forward and start talking about this. Okay? You also want to let the victims and the perpetrators know that we're going to be talking about this issue, we're going to be dealing with this issue, and then we're going to be done with it. Okay? The other thing, just on a practical point, TRCs are supposed to have final reports, and you can't have a final report if it doesn't end, okay? If the TRC doesn't end. A final report is not just a transcript or a recording of what happened. It's actually an assessment, sort of detailing what kind of acts were very common, what kind of acts did the government specifically organize, what ones did an armed opposition group maybe organize, or at least turn a blind eye to. So it is more of a resume and a conclusion to what happened. Now these reports, on the other hand, are not necessarily all the same in the sense that they're not always available to everyone. Zimbabwe had a TRC, Uganda had one, actually Uganda's had two, and their reports were secret. They were not released to the public. Whereas South Africa's TRC not only was conducted very much in the public eye, a lot of the testimony was put live on television, almost all of it was put live on radio, and the end results were very widely disseminated, published and disseminated. You can find, actually, the South African TRC online quite easily. Okay, another very common characteristic is it's run by the state. Okay, it's not run by a private organization. It's not run by a political party, although there have been some exceptions, nor are they normally run by an international organization. They're normally run by the government or subsets of that government, like a state or a city or a county. It's done by the country itself. Because part of the point of a TRC, which we'll get to also, is to create a sense of national healing and national testimony. It's not about going global, so to speak. And then a fourth thing is that these are not tribunals. Okay? These are not courts of law. There is not prosecution involved. Instead, this is about restorative justice as opposed to retributive justice. Retributive justice is more about punishment. Okay? I mean, a death penalty is a most extreme example, but other things like putting someone in jail or giving someone 50 lashes, banishing someone, etc. So really punishing that individual. Where restorative justice is more about sort of bringing the community back together, trying to make the community whole again, trying to make people as happy and or comfortable as possible after some horrific events. And therefore it's more about forgiveness. Forgiveness for the perpetrators. This is also why some people consider restorative justice or TRCs to be about societal satisfaction. Okay? Trying to make the society better off. But it's not necessarily about individual satisfaction. And you can all, I'm sure, think of examples yourselves where you've been hurt, or you know someone who's been hurt, or you've heard about someone being hurt, especially in a horrific manner, where if you told them, oh, we're going to have this person come in and talk about what they did, and then we're going to let them go, that person's not going to be terribly happy. Okay? But if we're talking about amnesty, if we're talking about having people testify and having people admit certain truths and detail certain events in return for not being prosecuted, that might seem unfair. But there is a trade-off going on in a TRC situation, at least ideally. And that is that amnesty is the carrot, it's the payment, so to speak, for getting to the truth. Okay? And one thing I'm not going to play, although I will describe it briefly, because I played it for the class earlier. It's several minutes long, so I don't want to take up too much time. But I played some testimony from the TRC that's going on right now in the Gambia. And first, I played some clips from some interviews with some people who were victims of Yahya Jammeh's regime. And these people were talking about the importance of knowing what happened. So one man in particular, he talks about, I want to know why they did this. I want to know who decided who was going to be tortured and who was going to be killed. I want to try to understand, I want to try to make sense of why my country was torn apart. Another woman talked about how her son disappeared. He was part of an opposition movement. He'd been gone for several years, and she just wanted to know where he was. She wanted to know whether he was alive or not. Now, she knew he wasn't alive. I mean, really. But she did not, at the same time, really know that he was not still alive. She wanted closure. She wanted confirmation that he was dead, and she also wanted to know where his body was. She wanted to be able to do funerary rites for him. So I played these for the class because I wanted to play an example of how getting this type of truth can be very important for people. It can be a valuable sort of recompense for allowing people to get off after having done these horrific crimes. But then I also played a clip from Edward Signate, who was second in command, only below Yahya Jammeh, second in command in the Gambia during this long period of oppression and occasional torture and even occasional murder. And it's his testimony. He's answering questions. And people are asking him, did you organize this killing? Did you organize this execution? And he keeps saying, absolutely, sir. Absolutely, sir. He's very polite. The person asks him, do you admit to having done these criminal acts? And he says, yes, sir. I agree, sir. And this is a person who's going to get off. If we had more time, I would play these clips. I can show you where these clips are if you're interested in listening to them afterwards. They're on BBC Africa. But it's sort of the two sides of how a TRC can work. You can understand how people want this truth, but you can also understand how it's a little uncomfortable to let someone like Edward Signate walk free. What is the truth, okay, when we're talking about a Truth and Reconciliation Committee? Well, while the South African TRC is not necessarily the exact model for all TRCs, I'm going to use their definitions, okay? So they had 4 identified truths that they were looking for. Number 1 were forensic truths. So facts, dates, names, number of people. So these 2 people executed these 5 people. Here are their 5 names on this date in this location. Okay, so basic facts, those truths. Number 2, what they called personal truth. And that's the ability of people to tell their stories. Or you could maybe call this a narrative truth or a personal narrative truth. So people being allowed, especially victims, this is mostly a truth for victims, to be able to say, this is what happened to me. This is how I experienced it. This is what I felt. This is what I saw. Okay? And again, this isn't a trial. So the TRC is not trying to say, yes, this person's testimony is 100% accurate. Okay? You've got the date wrong, or you got one of the names wrong, or something like that. It has nothing to do with it. Okay? That's more the facts, right? This is people being able to tell their personal truth, what happened to them, how the events affected them. I was tortured. My son disappeared. My whole family was killed. These types of personal narratives. Number 3 is sort of a social dialogue, or the social truth. So this collective storytelling, weaving all these stories together to try to better understand what was going on during this time period, involving this whole group of people. What in the world was the government thinking? What were the people resisting the government thinking? What were their motivations, and so forth. Number 4 is a restorative truth. This is sort of the goal. Okay? So trying to, within the context of all the stuff that happened, 1 through 3, trying to figure out what truth, what sort of collective sense of who this community is, or at least should be, what that group can be, or what that group can become, in order to reach a position of reconciliation, where they are no longer hating each other, trying to kill each other, trying to punish each other, and so forth. Okay? And if you can go down. So I just wanted to point out that number 2 is the most important for individuals. That's the personal narrative, okay? Because it's your opportunity as a victim to get your testimony or your experience officialized, put on the official record, recognized by the nation as a story that's important, okay? Recognized as something that is a certain type of truth, okay? And it's going to be in the record. Hopefully it'll be in the final report, but at the very least, people are going to have heard it, and in many cases it will be recorded, whether video and or audio. Now, number 3 and 4, okay, those were more important for the collective society, that restorative truth and that sort of collective narrative. But keep in mind that number 1, the facts, is by far and away the least important truth. Okay? That's not the main goal of a Truth and Reconciliation Committee, committee or commission. It's not to sort of establish who did what, where, when, etc. That is important. People are supposed to talk about that. But that's the least important thing. And if for no other reason, then we have lots of facts about a lot of things in this world that people don't believe and people don't care about. I mean, how much evidence out there is there about the Holocaust? And there's still Holocaust deniers. Okay? It's not these numbers and dates that are as important. Again, they're not unimportant, but they're not as important as the personal stories. Okay? If you go down. So then the second question is, what is reconciliation? What is the goal here? Well, so I'm stealing this from someone named Avron, who came up with this 3-step process of how you get to reconciliation in a truth and reconciliation situation where you want to set up a commission of that sort. He said, first of all, you need a settlement. Okay? He uses the word settlement. I think it might be easier to think about it in terms of a treaty, although I'm putting that in quote marks because oftentimes you're talking about a country. So this is an intra-national problem. So you're not technically signing treaties, but it's kind of like a treaty. You end the active violence. Okay? You make the bullets stop flying. Okay? That's the first step you have to do. If you don't do that, you can't move forward to the next step, which is resolution. Okay? Resolution means ending the root cause of the violence. Or you could say getting rid of the structural violence. The violence that exists even when the bullets aren't necessarily flying, right? If a certain ethnic group is not allowed to hold any positions of power, or if a certain ethnic group is readily and daily discriminated against, then that's a structural violence. That's a root cause, perhaps, of the more active, war violence, rebellion violence, that needs to be taken care of as well. Societies can have violence that doesn't involve active killing. And then finally, you get to reconciliation, which ideally is where you make new relationships between the people in this society that make the return of these causes unthinkable. Now, unthinkable, that is pretty idealistic, okay? But still, it's certainly a promising goal, right? That you want to have a new situation, new interactions between people where they can't even imagine going back to this situation where they're killing each other, discriminating against each other in horrific and in ways that lead to human rights violations. Okay, if you could just go down a little bit. I wanted to include some reactions, okay? So there's been some people who have looked at the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission and who have said, well, let me say this first. Most people consider the TRC in South Africa to have been a tremendous success. It's usually set up as a model example of TRCs. But there are some people who haven't agreed at the same time. And they haven't agreed for a number of different reasons. So one reason is, well, I guess I'm getting a little bit out of order here, but one reason is what Ruhana says. So I'll start with what Lederick says, which is that reconciliation needs truth, forgiveness, justice, and peace. Okay? Peace being that elimination of structural violence. And he says that you need all 4 of those things together to lead to a safe, comfortable society for everyone. But someone like Ruhana, who's not alone, this is just one name I'm picking. I mean, I could almost pick these names at random. There are lots of people who feel this way. Ruhana says that justice is far more important than forgiveness. That before you can start forgiving people, you have to have some sense of justice, where people who have done bad things are actually held accountable. Not just that they come into a situation like a TRC and admit to what they did. Okay? Because here's the problem with the TRC situation for some people. Okay? The usual model, the usual practice is to invite two types of people. The victims, which I've already talked about, they come in, they tell their stories. I suffered this way, my family suffered this way, my husband was tortured and then was killed, et cetera, et cetera. So they are getting their story recognized, officialized, as I said before. But the other group I haven't talked much about yet are the perpetrators. And what they are asked normally to do is to come in and to admit everything they did. Everything. That's one of the key elements. You're not allowed to say 85% of what you did. You're not allowed to talk about the, sort of bad and very bad things, but skip the truly horrific things you did. You have to admit everything. Okay? But if you admit everything, if you show some sort of contrition, if you show that you are sorry to some degree, that you're being sincere in the panel's opinion, and third, if you can show that what you did was for political reasons, okay, which is important. You can't say, I killed my neighbor because I wanted his land, and then get amnesty for that. That's just murder. Well, a lot of these cases are just murder. But the TRCs are allowing some people to go free or to get amnesty if they acted for political reasons. Okay? So if you can fulfill those three things, for a lot of TRCs, you're allowed to go free. Okay? And Ruhana is saying that doesn't cut it. You can't forgive these people just because they told the truth and feel sorry about it now. Okay? Someone else like Avruk identifies what he calls the one-too-many problem, which is a little confusing because one-too-many sounds like T-O-O, but that's not what he means. He means one, two, like facing many. Okay? So one person standing in for many people. Okay? That victims need to make this transfer from one person admitting they did something wrong. So let's take the South African situation, where you have one person getting up there and saying, I murdered these 7 activists, anti-apartheid activists this evening, this certain evening in 1986, because I was under orders by the apartheid regime to eliminate these people because they were causing too much trouble. I'm sorry about doing that. I feel terrible. I shouldn't have done that. I recognize that now, et cetera, et cetera. Now, that's already hard to forgive that person, okay? And I would just, again, I would ask you guys, I'm not asking for volunteers for sure, but, I'd ask you guys to think about something, really awful that someone did to you. One person did to you, and it probably was not as awful as the types of things we're encountering in many of these TRCs. And how hard was it to forgive that one person? Okay? Maybe you haven't forgiven that person. Okay? It's very difficult to forgive an individual who has betrayed your trust or physically hurt you or psychologically hurt you. Now, think about this situation with the person who admitted to killing the activists on behalf of the apartheid regime. Now, you're asking these victims to take that one person's testimony and not just forgive that one person, but forgive, to a certain degree, the entire white population of South Africa, or at least the entire pro-apartheid white population of South Africa. How much harder is that? Very hard is the answer. And that's our Avruk's point, is that it's that much harder to do this ideal of going from the specific and expanding it to a more general sense where you're forgiving thousands of people or tens of thousands of people, or even in some cases hundreds of thousands of people. Can you go a little farther down? Okay, some other disagreements. So there's a critic named Baker who argues that victims can be further victimized by this pressure to forgive. TRCs can be very popular. They can also be very unpopular. I'll get to that in a little bit. But the South African TRC was, for the most part, quite popular with a lot of people. And there's been other ones equally so. And so there might be victims who say, I don't want to go up and testify. I don't want to talk about my son being killed. I don't want to talk about seeing my wife be raped. I don't want to talk about all 5 of my children no longer being around. That's horrible for me. And yet, there's this pressure. It's the popular thing to do. It's the right thing to do. So Baker has criticized TRCs for putting too much pressure. And remember, there's those time pressures too. There might only be 6 months or a year to do this. And then you never get a chance again. So he's criticized them for not giving victims really enough freedom to decide whether they want to testify or not. Winslow makes roughly the same argument. He says, look, that collective forgiveness, that sense of helping out the nation, helping out the community is absolutely true, and it's absolutely valuable. But it sometimes comes at the expense of individuals, that they're hurt. They're harmed by this. They want more than just this testimony. Or Wilson, who does see success in creating a national victim and a national collective consciousness, that yes, it's great to have those types of testimony on file, but again, for certain individuals, it's not that helpful, not that useful. Okay, so I don't want to go too much into South Africa's situation, aside from saying that it is generally, like I said before, that it's generally been considered a very successful one, although there's been people who have absolutely criticized it as well. But I also wanted to put forth some other examples, okay? Some other examples from around the continent of Africa. So one of them is Sierra Leone. And you'll note I put this little mile marker on there, 7,400 miles. Why did I do that? I did that to make a point. Sierra Leone is roughly 7,400 miles away from South Africa. And I want to make that point because a Truth and Reconciliation Committee was set up in Sierra Leone after the roughly 10-year civil war there. That Truth and Reconciliation Commission was set up mostly under heavy pressure by external international organizations who came in with money and who said, we'll give you money to rebuild your country, we'll give you money to retrain former child soldiers, we'll give you money to help former continuing amputees, and so forth, but you have to do a TRC, because TRC works so well in South Africa. Well, South Africa is 7,400 miles away, and Sierra Leone is not South Africa, okay? I don't know how many of you have heard this. I hear this a lot, teaching a lot of classes about Africa. Africa is not an interesting country. Africa is not a country, right? Africa is a continent, and Africa is a very diverse continent. And Sierra Leone is not South Africa. And the imposition, or at least the feeling that there was an imposition of the TRC, the Sierra Leonean government agreed to it. I don't want to suggest that it was literally imposed, but it was financially imposed. It was financially encouraged. And a lot of Sierra Leoneans did not like the TRC. They felt it was inappropriate. They felt that the people who had done these horrible things needed to be punished, okay? Not restored to the community. And one of the rallying cries became no peace without justice. Okay? Now, and also a critic named Hayner noted that the TRC in Sierra Leone did something worse. It didn't allow people to socially forget what happened. It forced people to keep reliving some of the horrors that had happened to them. It re-traumatized them, in effect. Now, here's an example of a quote from someone who lived in a village that had been attacked during the war, in fact, attacked several times. He said, quote, one boy from this village did many terrible things during the war. He smoked a lot of weed, took drugs, and did crazy things. The thing he liked to do most was kneel on people and use a razor blade to carve the letters RUF on their chests. No one ordered him to do these things. He can never return to this village. This person is not interested in forgiveness for this specific person. This person does not want to see this person restored to the community. On the other hand, listen to or read this quote from, not from that person, not from that former child soldier, but from a former child soldier. Quote, before people blame me, they should ask who started the war. I can tell you it was not the children. I am sorry for what I did during the war, but if people treat me as a criminal, I will go back to the bush. And back to the bush means back into the life of a child soldier, back into an opposition group, an armed opposition group. So again, we have a tension here. You can understand this person saying, hell no, this person does not get to come back and rejoin us. But you can also understand this very practical point that the child soldier is making, which is if you don't make, this is not necessarily a direct threat, but he's making, in a sense, a threat. If you don't make a place for me, then I'm going to keep doing what I've been doing. What else do I have to do? Where else is he going to go? Is he going to go to college? No, he doesn't have those types of options. I also just wanted to point out there's a film called Ezra, which unfortunately is pretty hard to access. If you're part of the UNM community, there is a copy at the Language Learning Center, which is in Ortega Hall, that addresses a lot of these issues very, very well. It was shot in Sierra Leone, and in fact, it was shot almost entirely using former child soldiers, actors, stage managers, and all sorts of different aspects of the production. Okay, so what ended up happening, they did do the TRCs. They did do the TRCs in Sierra Leone, but like I said, they weren't very popular. But then they came up with a different, right there, up. They came up with a different solution, which was to use Konkoli committees, okay, which roughly means togetherness groups. Okay? No problem, it's not the best PowerPoint. So the Konkoli committees were things that had already existed. They were situations where people would get together, discuss problems, try to figure out how to find solutions for problems. So they sort of transformed these into community development committees, meaning what? Meaning there was some outside influence. The outside influence would be, we're going to give you some money, okay? We're going to give you some money to do something to help your village. But you guys get together and decide what you want to do. Okay? The only restriction is everyone has to participate, not just the old guys. Okay? The women get to be involved, the boys, the girls, everyone has to talk about what's going to happen, okay? What you're going to do with the money. So what ended up happening is everyone starts talking, including both perpetrators and victims. Then they would decide on a project, build latrines, build a new school, build houses, whatever they decided on as a group. And then they would work together with the money, with the equipment, the materials, to do whatever they had decided to do. So they were encouraging these mixed groups of perpetrators and victims to work side by side. So this isn't a TRC, right? The TRC was not very successful in Sierra Leone. But it was sort of TRC-ish, and that you're trying to get these people to dialogue together. If they're working together, they have to talk to each other to a certain degree. The point was to try to encourage cooperation and empathy in both directions. And if you can go down to and I have a couple quotes here as well from people who were involved in these projects. So one of them, from a former child soldier, he says, "When I came out of the bush, I didn't know what I would do, how I would live, nothing. I didn't know if it's possible to live in the village or maybe I should go fight again. But I was so tired of fighting, I decided to try another way." Participating in this activity. I think more importantly is the second quote, or more important is the second quote. Quote, "Before, I thought they were like animals. I heard such horrible stories. But we worked together in building the school. We helped each other, laughed together, and made something very good that helps our village a lot. Now I see they are like us in so many ways. It is time to stop the fighting." This is what TRCs are supposed to do, okay? To encourage this recognition of each other's humanity to show empathy between each other. Okay. The next thing, I know I'm skipping around here fairly fast, but I also want to talk about Rwanda, which again is not South Africa. Okay? It's closer, but still 2,700 miles away. Rwanda turned more to what are called gacaca courts, okay? Justice in the grass. This is a long-standing traditional practice where communities would get together and talk out their problems. So again, this is more homegrown. Okay? They set up 12,000 of these community courts, and they were designed to do three things: encourage forgiveness, okay? Encourage people to accept their guilt for things they had done badly, and to reconcile the community, to bring people together. Now, they were doing this for 1 million people. 1 million people. And I point that out because what would be an alternative? An alternative would be to put everyone on trial. Good luck with 1 million people. Okay? That would cost an enormous amount of money. And one person estimated that it would take 200 years to put those 1 million people on trial. Okay? That's impossible. I mean, that's not going to happen, of course. So the gacaca courts are also considered a rousing success, and part of the point being that it's something that Rwandans already knew about and had experienced, they were familiar with. It was more homegrown. And yet even here, I am purposefully making this a little bit more complicated because these are not easy answers. So on the other hand, someone named Chakravarti just came out with a book recently. I think it was like about 8 months ago. And this person, she did a lot of research on the gacaca courts, and she found that, unfortunately, while she's not totally against them, she found that they led to a lot of political patronage and clientelism. Meaning what? Meaning that people who were on the wrong side of actions, so mostly Hutus, not exclusively, but mostly Hutus, that they started to figure out that if they prostrated themselves to these gacaca courts, if they said, I did all these horrible things, and more importantly, if they named names of other people, that they could get higher positions in the now Tutsi-dominated government. So people were starting to sell, in her opinion, people were starting to sell out other people in order to gain political rewards for themselves. And people were starting to sort of play a game as opposed to telling the truth. And if you could go down one more, this is the end. Then I'm going to go back to the Gambia, which I was talking about earlier, 7,600 miles away from South Africa. Okay, so the Gambia decided to do a TRC model. So, it's not necessarily something that's homegrown, but it is something that they decided on. And Adama Barrow, who's now the president, he said, this is going to be, quote, a historic step forward towards discovering the truth for national healing. And then he also said that these courts are going to investigate and establish an impartial historical record. Okay, these are good things. These sound good. But again, that's the guy I mentioned earlier, Edward Singate. It's a little disturbing to hear him. Absolutely, sir. I agree, sir. I did these horrible things, sir. So we'll see. I mean, this is ongoing. It's happening right now in the Gambia. So who knows how successful or unsuccessful it's going to be. With that said, I'm going to stop and I'm going to take any questions you might have. Yes?
So these are only internal within a certain country, not between countries?
For example, Gambia, yes, it's only for the Gambia. South Africa was only for South Africa, etc. They tend to only be internal Truth and Reconciliation Commissions.
And how are they usually, I don't know if I would say instigated, but are they usually done from internal pressure or from external pressure?
Okay, are they done by internal pressure or external pressure? It depends on the country. So, for example, like I said, in Sierra Leone, there was a lot of financial external pressure. And that's why a lot of people didn't like it. They felt like it was imposed on them. Okay? In other situations, it can be, there have been a lot of situations, not just in Africa and elsewhere as well, where international donors, whether it's the UN or whether it's a specific country like Norway. Norway is really big into these TRCs, encouraging TRCs in other countries. So in other countries as well, other situations as well, this financial pressure has been important because, anytime someone says, I'll give you $10 million to set up these courts, that $10 million is not only going to go to the functioning of these courts. That's going to go to, paying some other people for some other things. Sometimes, siphoning off some of that money. And so there is going to be some encouragement, some pressure from outside. But that's part of the, look, this is one of the reasons why I use this image from the Gambia for the poster. And I know it's kind of hard to see if you're far away, but you've got someone wearing traditional dress being sworn in by someone who looks like he stepped out of an English courtroom, okay? Because, the Gambia uses the English-style legal system, complete with the wig, right? The big white wig. So I just thought this was a good example of how the TRC model in the Gambia, on the one hand, is something that the local people, at least the local government, wants, and which it seems like the local population is pretty much in favor of. And yet, it's a model that's coming from outside. And it's a model that has been strongly influenced by Western nations. Western nations love the TRC model. They think it's really cool, to use sort of a flippant word, because it has this wonderful idea or ideal that everyone's going to get along. We're all going to talk about things, and then we're going to hold hands and dance in a circle, and everyone will be happy, and everything will go back to normal at that point. And that, obviously that's a wonderful, beautiful ideal. And I don't want to suggest that TRCs are failures across the board. They're not. Okay? They do have good effects. But there is a question as to how much they're encouraged around the world because Western nations are enamored of them.
Well, it's kind of ironic that it's the Western nations that kind of messed up these countries to begin with.
Right, okay, so it is true that Western countries, if you want to have a global TRC, then the place to have it would be, one of the places to have it would be on former colonial actions. Did someone had a hand up back? Yeah, in the far back.
How long does it take to determine if it's a success or not?
Okay, so that's a good question because let's take the example of South Africa. So if you look, there's a lot of journal articles and magazine articles and articles you can find on the internet talking about how wonderful the TRC was in South Africa and others saying how terrible it was. And the ones that say it's terrible say, look, it's been a little over 20 years now. And South Africa still has extreme disparities in wealth, extreme disparities in sort of social status, who are the CEOs of companies and who are the people working as janitors and so forth. So, and there's some serious crime problems too in South Africa. There are a lot of major cities in South Africa have neighborhoods, regions which are quite dangerous. And a lot of these disparities in poverty and crime and social status can still be traced on racial lines. Okay? So you can ask, has that structural violence gone away? And the answer I'd say most people would admit, no. On the other hand, think about the apartheid system. It truly created literal second-class citizens. It created a majority population that was treated as less than human for decades, even on top of a long colonial period where they weren't particularly treated well to begin with. When that majority population finally came to power, that could have been a bloodbath. It could have been a horrific situation for everyone involved, not just the whites, for the South African blacks and the South African coloreds. It could have been horrible. And yet it was not. Now, but then on the other hand, like I already said, the situation is not pristine, the situation is not great for everyone. So I mean, it's a good question, and it's a hard one to answer. How well has a given society emerged from a horrific situation? I mean, Rwanda is a very stable country, has a very strong economy, and an economy that's growing, that's attracting tremendous investment from China. But it's also a country where dissent is not particularly respected, where you don't have a lot of personal freedoms. But again, it's certainly a better situation, than it was in the mid-90s.
So I had a question on one of the slides that you have there. You said that the final reports are kept secret. Like, is that from the people within that country, or is it like to the rest of the world? Because it seems like if the final report is kept secret from the people that lived through these atrocities, it would just cause a lot more pain to them.
Right. I mean, I would say it's sort of a sham TRC. Yeah. When I say secret, I mean they conducted the hearings, they conducted the testimony behind closed doors. They didn't record it, or at least they didn't record it and release it publicly. And the final report was not something that was released to anyone. It was just held within the hands of the government. So, and I would certainly say that that's not particularly useful or fair to the people involved. So, it seems sort of like a whitewashing of the situation. So, did you?
How long is the Gambia TRC going to go on for?
Actually, that's a good question that I do not know. I don't know what their plan is. I do know it just started. It just started, I think, about 2 weeks ago. I think 13 days ago, maybe. But that's a good question. I should have looked that up. I don't know if the plan is a month, 6 months, a year. I have no idea. So, yes.
I would just like to ask if there's any indication as to what kind of preconditions in the society make a truth and reconciliation process more likely to succeed. If you've got strong religious tradition, if you've got a strong tradition of village level sorting out. I was just brought up short by seeing 12,000 of these committees in Rwanda. Now in South Africa, it was all in one place. And it seemed to me that there are a lot of factors, both from the history, the society, which go to make these things more or less effective.
Yeah. So I think there's a couple of things there. One is, as I've hinted at a couple of times, I think, for example, the Gacaca model or the Kankale committee, using those committees as a model, are more effective because they already were in existence. They already were something that people were familiar with, that they certainly weren't going to say, what is this outsider idea? What is this foreign, sort of neo-colonial legal concept, and so forth. So that's certainly one thing that's going to help. The other thing is, I think it's helped a lot who has talked about these things. So in South Africa, Desmond Tutu was in favor of these things, of the TRC. Nelson Mandela was in favor of the TRC. When you have people like that lining up behind an organization or a process like that, that also is going to help tremendously. Someone that people respect. And to be fair, on the other side, there were some people, I believe it was de Klerk, who also said, this is going to be a good thing, we need to embrace this, while Botha said it was a joke and should not be respected. So both his comments are undermining where de Klerk's are helping encourage the Afrikaner community to get involved. But the other thing is, it's a good observation that Rwanda is a small country, and they had 12,000. And South Africa is a pretty large country, and they had 1 location. That's a choice too. And it's a choice that I think it somewhat is going to influence how people react to it, but it's also telling what you want to get out of it. So in the Gacaca situation, the point is, let's have the people who actually already know each other and are going to have to live together, let's have them sort things out amongst themselves. I mean, I don't mean this in an uncaring way, but it's sort of like the central national government said, we don't care what you guys do in, Vaughan, New Mexico, or Deming, a small town. You guys live together, you guys work it out. And in a lot of ways, that's a smart move, because those are the people who are going to have to talk with each other and work with each other. You don't necessarily want it imposed on you from the capital. Okay? South Africa made a very, very different choice. They weren't going to concentrate on this sort of 1-on-1 or 10-on-10 or 50-on-50 interaction. They wanted to make a national statement. This is about all of us. This is about South Africa and all the different languages and all the different races and all the different social classes and political opinions and so forth. We're going to talk about we're going to establish a national consciousness of recognition that the apartheid system was wrong and it hurt a lot of people, and that the people who did a lot of the hurting are now sorry and want to be forgiven. So those types of choices, I'm not South African and I'm not Rwandan. So I don't know necessarily if those were obvious choices to make between the very local and the massive national approach. But those people definitely made that decision, and it seems to have worked out at least pretty well, if not very well. Are there other, we have time for one more question? Or maybe not. Oh, yeah.
Are you able to provide some kind of comparison to the success of these commissions between Africa and Latin America?
Okay, so I'll dodge the question and nonetheless answer it. So the dodge is no, because I don't really know about the effectiveness of the Latin American ones. I do know, so Argentina had one called Nunca Más, never again, that dealt a lot with sort of, for example, the disappeared situation. And, from what I've read, that one has been or was pretty successful. But Uruguay, for example, also did one of those secret ones where they never revealed any of the findings or the testimony. So I certainly wouldn't call that one very effective. Uruguay's actually had 2. I don't know if both of them were secret. I just know the first one was secret. Maybe the second one they learned from that. But something I can say, from my experience working as a lawyer, more close to home, I used to work on the Navajo Nation. And the Navajo Nation has something called Peacemaker Court. And Peacemaker Court is kind of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And it's been in existence for a very long time. And what you do is you bring, if there's a dispute between 2 people, you have them both come in to a traditional building. Everyone sits down. They are facing each other, so it's somewhat confrontational in that sense, but that's not the point. The 2 people come in, they come in with other people who are, you could call them witnesses, but they're friends and family members. And they sit across from each other, and someone who's respected from the community moderates the situation, and they talk about the problems. They say, you did this wrong thing to me, and I feel really bad. And the other person says, oh, well, I did that because I thought this, or you had done this to me first. And, it might start off a little bit like, you did it first, or you hurt me worse, or whatever. But the goal is to slowly but surely get everyone talking, so not just the 2 parties, but their friends and family, to say, yeah, but remember, you guys used to be best friends, you guys used to go out hunting, you guys can get along again, our families can get along again. And in a lot of cases, they're very, very successful. And they avoid expensive and long-lasting litigation. On the other hand, though, to close, to complicate things, they don't always work. And one situation where they don't always work, in fact, I felt that they rarely worked, was in domestic violence situations. Because when you put someone who's been beating someone else across from that person with friends supporting them, supporting basically their violence, their domestic violence, that can lead to the person, the victim, accepting that type of treatment and not necessarily resolving the underlying tensions. And so that's sort of my ending point. It's been my point all along. I think these can be really great means of creating peace, creating better understanding, but they're not easy, and they certainly don't work all the time. So, thanks.